Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. A very warm welcome to those joining us from around the world live and to those watching this webinar's recording. My name is Shevin Kohli, and I work at the World Economic Forum Center for Nature and Climate, and I'm very pleased to be today's moderator. Now, this webinar is brought to you by the Climate Governance Initiative, a nonprofit that empowers board directors on every continent to take climate action by enhancing their knowledge and skills in climate governance. Today's webinar is entitled Key Outcomes for Boards from COP16, and as the name suggests, it will focus on the key takeaways for boards and their companies from the biodiversity COP that concluded last week in Cali, Colombia. It comes at a very good moment as negotiators, businesses, and civil society are recharging batteries ahead of Climate COP29 that is due to begin next week in Baku in this very busy season of COP conferences. Should you be interested on the key outcomes from COP29, by the way, please join CGI's webinar on December 5th. Now, I believe most of you listening in know why nature loss matters to businesses and their boards. So perhaps just a quick recap to kick things off. Nature and its ecosystems provide businesses and, well, all economic actors with certain services, and these services support production activities across the economy. This can be any number of things, including pollination supporting crop yields, materials, water, and energy providing manufacturing inputs, and coastal buffers protecting infrastructure from extreme weather events, such as those increasingly precipitated by climate change. In turn, production activities can have a positive or negative impact on nature, and therefore a positive or negative impact on the future provision of nature's key services. Unfortunately, we know that business and economic activities have propelled nature into an alarming decline. Just over 1992 to 2014, produced capital, that is physical output and financial gain, doubled per person, while natural capital per person declined by 40%. The challenge for businesses and their boards is clear. We cannot continue to exploit nature for our gain. It is now too finite and too fragile for business as usual to continue. We need businesses to account for their impacts and dependencies on nature and move towards regenerative means of production. Now, this is also the message that repeatedly played out at COP16 over the last 2 weeks. While this session will focus purely on the takeaways for chairs and board members, like many of you, we thought to share 3 quick big picture takeaways from the conference first. Number 1, this was billed as the People's COP, and on that front, it delivered. You'll hear more from our panelists that attended the COP conference, but we've all been part of the beautiful event that Colombia created, making not just the blue zone negotiation significant, but also the green zone accessible and attractive for all. Over 23,000 delegates and many others participated, an unprecedented number. Fueled by Colombia's fantastic messaging, of course, its status as a mega biodiverse country, and the inclusion of civil society voices. As a result, we also saw the creation of the permanent subsidiary body for indigenous peoples and local communities under CBD Article 8J to elevate the role of indigenous knowledge in the implementation of the GBF. Second, this was also billed as the implementation COP, and the signs were positive. While many countries missed the deadline to submit the updated national biodiversity plans, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It takes time to build a thoughtful and effective plan, more than 2 years, as was the case now, perhaps. And most countries have a few indicators that they're already tracking. And finally, this was also billed as the financing COP, and progress was slow but encouraging. Less progress on establishing a biodiversity fund under the GBF, but the interest in biodiversity finance was at an all-time high, which is itself a step change from past conferences. Now, enough from me. We're very pleased to be with an esteemed panel of guests today. And first, we're going to turn to Mr. Tony Goldner, who is the CEO of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or to most of you, the TNFD, to help us set the scene a bit more on how the nature agenda advanced for businesses at COP16. And first, a bit more about Tony. So for over 2 decades, Tony has advised government, the financial sector, and philanthropic leaders on a range of challenges at the intersection of business, finance, and public policy. He began his career in the Australian diplomatic service before moving into the private sector, where he has had stints in investment banking, then as a partner at Monitor Deloitte, then with the World Bank Group. Tony, over to you. How do you think the agenda moved forward from a business perspective? And maybe could you share a bit more about TNFD's big news from COP16 too?
Sure. Thanks so much, Shiv, and nice to be with everyone. I think overall, my assessment of COP16 might be slightly more pessimistic than yours. I don't think enough progress was made, but you certainly highlighted a number of key areas of progress, notably on Indigenous people, giving them a permanent voice in the process, which is really important. And also, obviously, the new Kali Fund, talking about payments for digital DSI or the digital information we get from nature. So I think those two are definitely highlights. I think the lack of progress on resource mobilization is a significant issue. But having said that, I don't think that changes the equation or the calculus for why business should be focused on nature. And I think that's probably the bigger takeaway. If we go backwards to COP15, COP15 really set the goalposts for global action on nature, and that's the most significant thing. We now have an equivalent set of targets to the Paris Agreement on climate. Those were agreed in Montreal 2 years ago. This COP was really about trying to make substantial concrete progress forward on a number of those fronts. And as I said, in some areas we made progress, and other areas the progress wasn't as fast. I think TNFD specifically, we relate to what's called Target 15, which is the target that calls for corporate disclosure of impacts, risks, and dependencies on nature. And I think we feel, and this was acknowledged in the conversations in Cali last week, that really TNFD has operationalized Target 15. We've now mobilized, and this speaks to the first of our announcements, we've now crossed 500 organizations globally that have committed to getting started on their nature-related reporting, which is significant. It's about 17 trillion in assets under management and about 7 trillion in public equities. So it's a start. We're certainly humble and modest in our sense of progress. That's about 10% of what we think we should be mobilizing around nature-related reporting. But I think we're making progress. The private sector is moving in terms of adoption of the TNFD recommendations, and the TNFD covers all realms of nature, so atmosphere, except for GHG emissions, freshwater, oceans, and land, and it covers impacts, dependencies, and risks as called for by the GBF signed in Montreal. We also cover opportunities as well. So we cover all the bases required for Target 15, and I think what we've seen over the last 2 years, particularly the last 12 months since our recommendations were launched, is that the private sector is actually now moving ahead, I think, of the progress that we've seen by the intergovernmental process through the COPs. So that's really encouraging news. And as I said, I don't think it fundamentally changes the calculus for business. And the reason is simple, that the resilience of business depends on the resilience of nature. As you said in your opening comments, every business has dependencies on this flow of ecosystem services into its business model. And I think what we've seen, certainly since the TNFD was created 3 years ago, is a real shift in the mindset around awareness that we can't get to net zero on the climate side without nature, and we have to fundamentally be proactively managing these dependencies on nature as well. So I'm encouraged by the progress. We had a fantastic level of engagement in the 20-odd events that we organized in Cali over the 2 weeks. And I haven't seen exact numbers, but I've heard estimates that there was about 3,000 business and finance delegates in Cali. And that's about 3 times the number that were in Montreal. So we're seeing a huge amount of involvement. And I think we've really seen a measurable change in the conversation from, if I go back to COP26 in Glasgow when TNFD was formed, we were still talking about, what is this nature conversation and how does it relate to climate change? Then we've talked about, climate and nature being flip sides of the same coin. And I think at Cali last week, there's now an appreciation that we have to move to implementation. So we've gone from awareness into a real sense about, okay, what do we need to do about this? Both in terms of better risk management, which of course informs better strategy, but also on the opportunity side. And there was a lot of discussion around nature-based solutions, about biodiversity credits, about how business and finance can take concrete action to contribute to nature positive outcomes for the planet. So I'm a bit discouraged by the progress in the intergovernmental approach and the progress that was made in Cali, but I'm encouraged by the level of business and finance engagement, by the shift in the conversation, and the fact that investors are now starting to ask more questions through their stewardship activities. Companies are now doing their assessment of their internal issues, their internal assessment of those nature-related issues, and we're now starting to see that flow through into disclosures. So a mixed bag, I guess, would be my readout from Kali Shivan, but I think the most encouraging news, particularly for boards, is that irrespective of the pace of progress in the intergovernmental process, I think nature now is on the board agenda as a strategic risk management issue. It needs to be managed proactively, and it's really encouraging to see more companies and financial institutions stepping up and taking concrete action.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. That really helps set the scene very well. And there's a number of threads that I would love to pick up on what you just covered, but maybe let's keep it to one or two really key ones. And let's start actually where you ended there. The idea that boards are also sitting up and taking a lot more notice of this. And maybe a two-part question back to you is, number one, did you notice a greater sense of urgency from businesses at COP16? Volume of folks, volume of conversations certainly there, but that sense of urgency is what a lot of us are banking on for this to turn into the implementation conversation we need. And second, do you see that urgency translating into nature being a permanent fixture in the boardroom? As we know, there's tons of things that are on the minds of boards today. Can nature take a seat at the table as it should, in your view?
Maybe I can answer the second question first, Shivan. I think nature has to have a seat at the board table, and I often use the analogy of cyber risk. There are very few boards now today in the world that would want to be caught short, not having a plan and not be thinking about the resilience of their organization to cyber risk. We need to get nature to the same place that is now the way the boards think about cyber risk. And it might sound a bit boring as an aspiration, but nature needs to be another key strategic risk management issue, and we can think about it actually in many ways in the same way we do about cyber risk. And in my narrative and in the narrative of TNFD now, we're increasingly talking about the resilience of nature. And I think that's language that works for boards, it works for executive teams, because of course, everyone has an investment in future resilience of their organization, of society, and of the economy. And so resilience immediately takes you to this notion of dependence. And certainly in our engagement over the last year, we've been doing more and more board presentations where we meet either with the audit committee of boards or in fact the full board. And I'm impressed by the fact that non-executive directors and executive directors are getting smart quite quickly now on nature. Obviously, there's a lot more companies we have to reach. But in some of the conversations I've had in the last 12 months, board members coming into the conversation, they've done their homework, they know they've got issues in the business, they know they need to start asking more questions of the company executives in order to make sure that they're exercising their responsibilities and that the company is thinking about nature as a resilience issue. This is no longer about corporate social responsibility. This is about strategic risk management. And what we're also seeing is as companies size up this issue, and in fact, some companies have now quantified their nature-related issues alongside their climate-related issues. And not surprisingly, the number is often bigger than their assessed climate-related risk. But as they do that, it changes the conversation in the board. We're seeing some companies moving nature and climate out from, say, a chief sustainability officer position under the chief financial officer, which tells you how it's changed in terms of its perception. And it is now being proactively managed as a risk issue, but also as a source of future value creation. And I think maybe we can come back to this point about the opportunity side of the equation as well. But one company that I spoke to 6 months ago said that they're now thinking about nature as a resilience issue, and they're now looking at about $1 billion of revenue in their business, about how do they underpin that revenue in the business by by underpinning the resilience of their dependencies on nature, because they've realized that they've got these fragilities in their business model because of those nature-related dependencies. So I think we're seeing that shift. Obviously, we've got a much larger population of companies and financial institutions that have to get to that awareness and reposition nature in that way. But I'm encouraged by some of the conversations I've had. And then I think in terms of your first question around urgency, I think frankly we need to be moving much faster. Not, as I said, not just for the benefit of the planet, but to underpin the resilience of our business models and future financial returns. If I were to use the language of that a CFO would understand, the future cash flows of the business depend on that future flow of ecosystem service benefits into the company. So we've got cash flows going in one direction, and obviously investors want to see positive returns, and that's what boards want to deliver to their shareholders. But we've got nature's resilience declining, which means these two things are heading in different directions. And so I think if we think about it in those terms, we need to see more action, further, faster, essentially. And so I think there are a lot of people came to Kali wanting to learn more, wanting to understand more, wanting to understand how to take practical action. But I think we've got to improve the sense of urgency, because I'm not sure that it's quite where we need to be. Not just from government and finance, but clearly, as we saw from the outcomes of COP16, frankly, also from governments.
Gotcha. Thank you, Tony. And I like the last bit that you said there. It's the sense of urgency also is a lot to do with the language that one uses in translating what that sense of urgency means for businesses. And the way you showed the cash flow versus nature's resilience, that juxtaposition is exactly the kind of conversation that takes that urgency and makes it more real. Tony, thank you for your thoughts in this segment. Lots to come back to you on during the Q&A. And again, we've got questions coming in already. Thank you to those who've been submitting their questions. For now, we're going to move to the next segment of the webinar. And I'm very pleased to introduce to you two stalwarts of the boardroom who are champions at bringing climate and nature to the table. And that's Sheila Murray and Mario Pardo Bayona. So first, Sheila is the chair of the board at Tech Resources, a post she has held since Feb 2020, having been a director since April 2018. And Sheila is also an advisory board member at CGI. Sheila has served as the president of the CI Financial Corp from 2016 to 2019 and was previously its executive vice president, general counsel, and secretary. Mario is the CEO of BBVA Colombia since 2020. Is chairman of the board of directors at Asobancaria, that's Colombia's banking association, since 2022, and is a member of the board at the Spanish Chamber of Commerce in Colombia since 2022. He has been at BBVA since 2008 and has held several senior global leadership roles. Folks, to both of you, and Sheila, first maybe to you, let's follow on from Tony's conversation there, and let's have your thoughts on what are some of the challenges that you've tackled in the boardroom related to nature action? How have you overcome them? And what are some of the opportunities that have come up along the way that's really made a difference in the companies that you steward?
All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in this world. And thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. As Shiva mentioned, I'm the chair of the board of Tech Resources. Tech is a global mining corporation headquartered in Canada. As a mining corporation, you can see that there may be some immediate tension between the goal of nature positive and the business that we do. We are involved in the mining of critical minerals, principally in North and South America, and we mine for copper and zinc and other metals that we believe are necessary for energy transition. We are focused on doing what's right for our world, mining those minerals that are necessary for this energy transition. But the very nature of what we do is disruptive to nature. Everything we do disrupts land, air, water systems, biodiversity. So for decades, the mining industry and tech in particular have been focused on how we mitigate the negative impacts of what we do as a business, while continuing to focus on doing what we do so well, which is bringing those minerals up. What we realized in the past 3 years is mere mitigation's not enough, that we have to make a difference, a positive difference. And so we started the journey with looking at our purpose and values. And 3 years ago, we wrote our purpose statement that included, obviously, our core purpose of producing and mining the minerals necessary for the future of the world. But we said at the end of that, and protecting the lands that we love. It sounds a little Pollyanna-ish in a North American sense. It sounds like a funny thing to put in a purpose statement, but we did it intentionally. Obviously, we mean it very sincerely. We will have no license to do what we do unless we take care of the land that we're doing it on. At the same time as we introduced our new purpose statement, we actually were one of the first adopters of a nature positive commitment, and we have made a commitment that we will be nature positive by 2030. We are replacing each hectare that we disturb, each hectare of land that we disturb, with 3 hectares of undisturbed or protected land. And we're working with the indigenous peoples and the communities in the countries in which we work to find the best way to do that. There is a tension, obviously. How do we, as a board, ensure that we're fulfilling our responsibility to all of our stakeholders, that we're doing the job we have to do, that we're making money, we're being profitable, at the same time as focusing on nature positive. We don't see those as inconsistent strategies. We actually believe that the only way forward for a mining company is to do it in a nature positive way. We will not have the license, the social and other license, to do what we want to do unless we are actively engaged in making things better, not just replacing things the way they used to be, but making the world better. And Tony, you're so right. We feel the urgency that you feel. And, we almost feel as if we're in a race. We're working hard with the indigenous communities on replacing free lands for animals to graze on. And we've created a park in northern Calgary, in northern Alberta, to do that. And we're working hard to make sure that we will still have the water, the air, the land that we need. It doesn't matter if you have solar panels and wind turbines, which is what we're producing our minerals so that they can work for those. Doesn't matter if you have those, if you haven't got nature. We have also adopted the TNFD guidelines. And Tony, I see you nodding, but we are just about to release our very first report. In fact, it's on the agenda for the board meeting next week. And in fact, we're having a full day session on financial disclosures. And I think it's going to be a really great day of education. We're getting there. It's a process, but I think that this may sound strange, but I think that the mining community had a bit of a head start because we've been so focused on environmental issues for so many decades. Adding nature onto that and moving in that direction, that was a necessary evolution, but we were already well up the curve. I think it's harder for the other industries that I've been involved in at the boardroom table to see it as a priority. But in mining, there's no question it is a huge priority. And I think you're going to see a lot of involvement from the international mining community. You've already seen quite a bit. You're going to see a lot more from the international mining community. We take it very seriously.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheila. And yes, the mining sector always comes up in conversations on natural capital accounting and valuation. That's really where a lot of the day-to-day work that I do focuses. And there's tons of threads I want to pick up with you, and I'm sure we're going to get questions on this too. But I want to turn to Mario first for his reactions to the same sort of question. Mario, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thanks also for the invite. Very happy to be here. So BBVA is a bank. We are present in 25 countries and responsible for our business here in Colombia. So you ask about challenges and opportunities. Well, the challenges, I think, are possibly common throughout industries, but maybe even more exacerbated here as a bank. We're used to just simplifying things into numbers as financiers. So when we look at what our strategy has delivered in terms of social impact, it was relatively easy. The levels of poverty are relatively easy to understand across geographies. Then when we move into climate action as an organization, also it was relatively easy to translate into equivalent greenhouse emissions as we look at different activities. So we have simple targets to understand by our people and our clients. When we move into nature, it becomes much more challenging. We have a lot of KPIs that cannot be made equivalent between each other. So that makes it more challenging throughout the organization and also at the board level. Just to give you a sense, so we launched with the IFC and the IDB, the first biodiversity bond in the financial sector globally a few months ago, 4 months ago. And to identify what would be within that biodiversity effort, we selected around 80 activities. And on average, each activity had 2 different KPIs. As a total, we have 150 KPIs where we measure the impact on biodiversity. So those KPIs, as I said, they cannot be added together. That makes it much more comfortable. I would say that's a key challenge from a training perspective and mobilizing an organization, engaging with clients, etc. But if I move to the opportunities, I would echo some of the things that Sheila and Tony already mentioned. So first of all, as I said, I'm based here in Colombia. Colombia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. So the number one opportunity, I would say, is society is not only ready for this, but they are asking for us to move on and protect biodiversity. They are very proud of what they see of nature. It's very easy to understand. They might not understand all the KPIs, but society as a whole understands much easier the impact on nature and biodiversity than the equivalent tons of the different greenhouse emissions. So it's very tangible and very high on the society agenda. Secondly, with regards to Colombia specifically, this fits very, very well with the social agenda and the climate action agenda. On the social agenda, very simple. So Colombia is a middle-income country, but with very high inequality levels. And poverty is basically concentrated in rural areas. We have extreme poverty in rural areas and poor people in the cities. So again, to tackle extreme poverty, a lot of the action has to be focused in rural areas. And that's where biodiversity fits very well with that strategy, and working with the local communities, indigenous communities, and overall people that live in the rurality. It also fits very, very well with climate action. In a country like Colombia, north of 50% of the greenhouse emissions come from land use. So agricultural activities and all land use related activities are responsible for north of 50% of those emissions. So again, nature fits very well. With those opportunities, we've been engaging with our board and at the group level on nature for a number of years. North of a year ago, around a year and a half ago, we launched the first blue bond here in Colombia that was basically focused on protecting that part of the nature capital that is related to water. Around 6 months ago, we launched a credit card to protect the coral reefs in the Colombian Caribbean region, which, by the way, had huge demand from clients. And as I mentioned earlier on, 4 months ago, we launched this first biodiversity bond, first with the IFC, then the IDB, and then another multilateral bank here in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the CAF, supported us. What I can tell you is that the sources of these finances, which is $120 million we got from this multilateral banks has received a huge demand from clients. So I'm going to close with this message. Private sector is moving in this direction. We have significant demand from private sector to finance activities that have a positive impact in nature. And therefore, I think for the financial sector, we have a very meaningful opportunity as we move, and we are early movers in this direction. Our clients, the real sector, is demanding this type of solutions. And as a whole, I think that makes everyone easier to mobilize at the board level and the organizational level to finance the investment needed to protect biodiversity is a very significant opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mario. And thank you to you too, Sheila. We're going to come back to both of you very shortly with your thoughts and contributions on a few other questions that have been coming in. But for our last segment before the Q&A, I just want to quickly turn to Marcelo Bejar first, who we're very pleased to have with us as well. So Marcelo is the Senior Advisor to COP30 at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, as it would be familiar to many of you. Marcelo was previously at Natura & Co. from 2013 to 2024, most recently holding the role of Vice President for Sustainability and Group Affairs. Marcelo has a very rich background working with NGOs as a journalist in the Brazilian government, and has devoted his career to connecting business and science with biodiversity, policy, and finance. Marcelo, welcome. I have one very simple question for you to kick things off, especially given your critical new role. What do you really see as good momentum in the nature space that we can take forward at the climate COPs, not just from COP16, but from all of the really encouraging developments that Sheila and Mario have covered? And starting, of course, with COP29 in Azerbaijan, but then, of course, keeping an eye on COP30, which will be in Belém next year.
Thank you so much, Steven, and really pleased to be with all of you, and thanks for the invitation from Cambridge and the organizers. And it's my pleasure to be with Tony, my friend, again from TNFD. And well, to get your question, I think it's important for us to remember about the film for COPs, right? So I'm speaking to you from Brazil, from São Paulo, and all COPs started here in Brazil back in 1992, when the United Nations held the Earth Conference. That was the mother of COPs. And that was also when WBCSD, the organization that I'm here today speaking on behalf, was founded. So there was the idea since the beginning, since 92, to connect businesses to how climate would be tackled and how nature would evolve. So we've been on this journey for a while, and the journey has only improved. So I think the direction that we are taking is the correct one. The pace is not. So we certainly need to improve the pace if we really want to reach the goals that were established back then. How do I see things progressing? And I was in Cali with Tony and many others, and with yourself, and I saw a lot of progress, not only by over 3,000 business attending the conference and setting very clear messages on metrics and how to connect the dots. And I think here for board members, the most important and difficult things is to connect the dots from business to climate to nature. And that's what we should be aiming for, not only for COP29, for COP30, but for the whole journey. And the way that I split those different aspects of the equation, since I was managing a company that operated in over 100 markets and was not easy to connect all the acronyms and the frameworks from sustainability, each one addressing a specific metric that sometimes was not replicable in other geographies. I'm nowadays really sure that we should take a closer look to only 4 of them. I think we need to look on science very deeply. And I think on the climate agenda, we know where the numbers are with a right amount of certainty. So we know that UNFCCC, the UN body that assembles hundreds of scientists globally, knows exactly where emissions are coming from. So we know how the 42 million gigatons are issued, and we know what is the connection between the $100 trillion GDP that we yearly produce to the 42 million gigatons that we issue for producing that. We know on public policy, since the Paris Agreement, where each and every country is on emissions. So we know the film on how they are emitting and how they're committing themselves to lower emissions. So now it's for us to connect the dots between science and policy. And we have two main instruments to do that. On private sector, probably nowadays, the best instrument is still science-based targets initiative. So connecting the numbers that we have and that we can report to the market and have a third-party supervisioning where these numbers come from. So knowing how much we are emitting every year. And on TCFD, that inspired Tony's initiative, we know exactly from finance which are the risks associated to those emissions and how can we connect the dots. The problem of the climate agenda is that one thing does not rely on the other or does not support the other. So we cannot build yet financial instruments that are correctly tackling emissions individually, nationally, that will have the scientific benefit. So that's for us to build between now and the following COPs, is how to connect the dots on climate. And on the nature agenda, if we flip the page on sustainability, we must give exactly the same discipline to nature that we have on climate. So we do have an institute in Bonn called IPBS that is assembling scientists globally, and they are putting together numbers on nature. Of course, on nature, it's very local based. And as Sheila pointed, you have to take into consideration your own landscape. If you want to produce credible reports, you cannot do something that will extrapolate from abstract numbers as you can do from climate. So this is why having public policy is so important for nature. And what we saw in Cali last week was a very good improvement on the so-called NBSAPs, so the National Plans for Nature. NBSAPs are even more important than the NDCs because the NBSAPs are not replaceable. The NDCs, you can take some numbers from one geography and take them down in another one. The global effect will be the same. On nature, the effects are totally different if you bring nature from one region into the other. So it must be locally based. That's why all the work on NBSAPs can take longer because they need to thoroughly consult local communities and they must be attached to public policy. On the private sector side of things, we have to improve our reporting capabilities and our capacity to have third-party reviewing what we're doing. So SBTNs are progressing. We have a few companies reporting under that criteria. We don't know if this will be the end criteria, but that's a very good one for a start. And we do have on financials, as Tony here represented so well always, TNFD connecting the dots between finance and nature. So we know the risk exposure and the opportunities that companies have on the financial sector, on the financial side of things. Now, I think what we'll be seeing more and more between COP29 and COP30, which will create, we hope, a new cycle connecting those dots, will be the communication between the NDCs and the NBSAPs. So connecting the national plans on emissions and nature. So we will no longer be able to have solutions that can be at the same time climate positive and nature negative. This is something that we should deeply avoid. So things should always move on the right direction with the right pace, which is connecting to climate criteria, bringing nature on board and bringing nature back. Just to wrap up this initial segment, I would say that there are new instruments being created for tackling the main concerns on nature on the three main angles. So one is conservation, the second one is the running economy, and the third one is regeneration. So Brazil's proposal for the first one, for conservation, is to create what is called TFFF. I promise we'll get a better name for it shortly, but so far it's called TFFF, Tropical Forest Forever Fund. So this is a fund of $125 billion that will allow standing forests to receive the payment for the environmental services that they provide. This will be fundamental for the success on preservation. So this will be on sovereign funds and pension funds to bring the resources that will allow not only the Amazon, which is reaching its tipping point, but also tropical forests in the middle of Central Africa and in Southeast Asia to be rewarded by the environmental services that they provide. For the economy side of things, I don't know if everyone is aware, but G20 is happening now in Brazil as well. And a month ago, the G20 bioeconomy principles were approved by consensus. I think shifting from regular economy into the bioeconomy and agreeing on how can we build better, sustainably with biomass will be the future. And for this, I think COP29 and COP30 will play a major role, giving the metrics, the standards that will allow us to move from the regular and brown economy into the bioeconomy. So that's one pace that I think the world must follow. And the final one is regeneration and bringing nature back, which is something that we'll be seeing more and more. And we will be only able to do that if we create the global carbon market and we attach the global carbon market to nature standards with gold standards, connecting nature-based solutions to carbon emissions in a very thorough and credible way, which I think it's the challenge that we have between now and next year. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marcelo. There's so many points that you covered in there, but very much appreciate how you've connected climate and nature together. It's a question that comes up quite often with board discussions that we've had with the Climate Governance Initiative in the past. And this is a very good way to tie it together, both at the multilateral level, but then also bringing it together for businesses. So thank you for that. And we've got, look, a number of questions now that we're going to sift through. We're going to open it up to these questions, and I'm going to ask maybe one or two of you to answer the questions first, but remember that these questions are open to all. We've got quite a few, so encourage sharp responses as much as possible. And the first question, maybe we can start off, Marcelo, with you, and maybe Tony as well. One of the questions that came up was that, we keep hearing a lot about funds at these multilaterals. And a lot of the times, the funds, the conversations are great to start with, but as we saw in Cali, the actual commitments and disbursements are a very different story. So the question is, how can we make funds more effective? And really, what is their role in achieving the objectives under, say, the Paris Agreement or the Biodiversity COP Agreement?
Tony, do you want to go first, or do I take this one? Can I?
Yeah. I will follow your lead, Marcelo.
Okay, my friend. So this is a fundamental question, and I'm a bit blushed to speak about funds in front of Mario, who's really the expert on finance here. But let me try to give two hints of this. First one is on how can we bring nature back and how can we build the transition plans with high interest rates as we've been witnessing since COVID. So this is blended finance will play a major role here. So just to give you a quick example, in the UK nowadays, everyone is complaining that they still have very high interest rates, around 5%. Here in Brazil, we are witnessing now 10.75% interest rate. So when we produce instruments that will bring those numbers down, connecting them and attaching them to emissions or to nature, I think this will be the key moving forward from a company's perspective. So allowing CapEx to be built upon instruments that will have more friendly financials is not that hard, since instruments like the Japanese Development Bank borrows for 1% a year, et cetera, there are ways for us to create blended with philanthropy or without philanthropy with development banks that will allow financials to flow on the right direction. And I'll give you now a very practical example. When I was running a company, I tried to create a sustainability-linked bond attaching to nature metrics. And we spoke to global banks, and the idea was quite simple. So by sponsoring projects that will enhance 1 million hectares in nature preservation, we would request a reduction per year when each hectare was preserved for the next 10 years. And what the financial system back then told us was there is no comparability with instruments that have been already granted. So please shift it to carbon and to emissions, which is something that we have better instruments to read. And we did it because we also tracked our emissions down, and it was super well received. We issued a $1 billion bond. There was the ask for 3.6 billion. So it was really well received. But I think we missed an opportunity back then to really create a financial instrument that would attach at the same time better interest rates, better nature protection, and performance. So I think that will be the future. And just to wrap up on a more public side of things and on the public perspective for creating those funds, I think there is a lot of ask for connecting the historical background on how we get to where we are and who was responsible for bringing us here to the financials that will take us out of here. So that is a political demand that will only increase. But I think that's just part of the equation. The other part of the equation is it's everyone's problem at the same time. So I think we'll have to address both of them. We'll have to address money coming from the north to the south, for sure, but we'll also have to attach the sovereign funds from the south directly to nature and to emissions if we want to make them efficient. I think if we move on both directions, we'll get this faster than we expect. Tony, ball with you.
Thanks, Marcelo. I'll just build on your comments. I think, Shivan, sort of two thoughts from me. One is, I think the momentum around setting up new funds is a positive development, but of course, every new fund comes with startup costs. They take a lot of time. There are complex governance issues. So I'm a little bit concerned about a proliferation of new funds, a different fund for every issue. And I think there's, in Cali, there was some comments about should we be doubling down on the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which is now being managed by the GEF, or some countries, I believe, were unhappy with that and now proposing another fund. So I think we've got to strike the right balance between having funds for particular purposes without seeing a proliferation of funds, because of course, if they all take years to set up the governance and we end up losing 20% of the funds in overheads, then I think there's a risk that too many funds could be counterproductive. We'd be better off. I'd rather see us focusing on rallying the funding that we do have into fewer vehicles, given that we've got sort of 6 years to 2030 to really show concrete progress. And then the second question in my mind, which is related to that, is obviously when you think of funds, you think about sources and uses of funds, right? So where are the funds coming from? I think the real significance of the Kali Fund on digital sequencing information is actually the model that has been approved. So this is essentially a percentage on corporate revenues or profits. We've been talking for decades about transaction taxes of some sort and things. I think it's quite interesting that we've now just seen governments rally around a model, even though it's voluntary, which is a percentage of corporate revenues or corporate profits. Now, of course, companies, as I said, it's voluntary, so we may see low take-up. I think it's worth thinking about what additional layers of incentives could be added on top of that. For example, maybe the contributions could be tax deductible by the host governments as a way of creating further incentives for corporate uptake. So I think there's more work to do. We've got to think about these things in 3 dimensions rather than 1 dimension. And then, as Marcelo said, it's not just about the governments, but also how do we then layer over philanthropic funding and other potential sources of funding. And then on the uses side, I think as we see more fund models emerge, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny about what will the use of the funds be for. I think there will rightly be a lot of concern if the funding goes to governments and make their way into general budgets and they're paying for things that are not related to conservation. So I think being quite prescriptive about how the funds are being used, and then, of course, the accountability and the transparency and the auditing and assurance around whether the funds are actually used for the purposes intended is going to be a really important international priority, so that we can all have confidence that as these models take hold and as money is provided from whatever source, that we can all have a high degree of confidence that the money is in fact going to nature restoration, rather than being channeled off for other purposes, general budget expenses or other things, which I think would cause a lot of concern and then obviously undercut confidence in these vehicles, and then we'll end up back at square one.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Marcelo. Tony, there's a bit of gold dust in what you said there on internal mobilization in the private sector of funding. That's often not something that is featured in the $200 billion target under the GBF or under the $711 billion biodiversity annual finance gap. So that is something that we very much need to be paying as much attention to as the big funds that have money deposited in them by the national and international organizations. And that's actually a nice bridge to questions that I think will be very helpful for Sheila and Mario to answer now. I think one big theme that's coming out is something along the lines of how often does nature and nature finance come up in board discussions relative to other topics, and how have you helped make it feature on the board agenda every single time? I think that's a very practical, very interesting way that we can take some of the insights from these conversations into some real takeaways for the audience. So maybe Sheila first, and then to you, Mario. Mario, there's one more question that I want to come to you for as well before we conclude. So over to you.
Okay. So just talking about how often nature is on the agenda and how we manage it. We have a safety and sustainability committee of the board of directors, and that sustainability committee is the committee that takes principal responsibility for nature as well as climate change. It is on the agenda every quarter. There's a presentation by our chief sustainability officer every quarter to that committee, and then it is at least once a year on the full board agenda. Having said that, nature kind of bleeds into so much of what we do. We have to manage nature when we're talking about permitting or moving into a new jurisdiction. It is a topic when we talk about strategy and where we head next and what our goals are for the next 5 to 10 years. So nature is on the agenda in a micro level at each sustainability committee meeting, and on a macro level at the board table. And how do we keep it front and center? We've got a deep group of executives at Tech who are involved in the area, and it moves up the chain, obviously, to the board. We make sure that there are KPIs and performance metrics around nature that our executive is compensated on. So the compensation committee gets involved in looking at nature metrics, what we're doing. We have tangible goals, and that keeps it front and center. But, as I said, in the mining industry, you cannot mine unless you're sensitive to nature and the environment. You will not have the social permission to mine anywhere. And so, we aren't just doing it because it's the right thing to do. Frankly, we're doing it because it's the only way forward. And mining companies will not be permitted to continue to operate unless they take these matters seriously. So it is top of mind and front and center for our board, and I'm sure all mining company boards.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sheila. Mario, same question to you, just overlaid with one more input, which is how should boards think about their relationship or their company's relationship with the finance sector as well on nature?
Sure. Well, on the board discussions and how we are organized is very similar to what Sheila said. So I'm not going to repeat what what she said. I just wanted to make also an extra point on the financing aspect of it that we discussed earlier on. I would say three comments. One is even though that is, I would say that is the biggest negative out of the Cali COP, the inability to agree on meaningful larger funding. I would say that on a relative basis, compared to the overall funding needs regarding the road to net zero in climate action, I think biodiversity we have, as a whole, less funding needs. Obviously, there's much less requirements in the industrial sector. And I think that's a positive thing. The challenge in terms of reaching funding is smaller. On the other hand, I would say the negative part of it is that there is still a meaningful part of what needs to be done with regards to biodiversity that is not doesn't have business cases. It's not economically viable. And I think this is related to the fact that incentives, positive and negative incentives in terms of regulatory aspects are less advanced than with regards to climate action. So we need governments to move forward so that we have faster incentives in place with regards to biodiversity. Then with regards to what how we interact with the board with regards to financing, I think it's the direction is obvious. We've discussed this on this call. It's a question of how do we go faster. And obviously, the basic is training. The second is metrics. The third is regulation. So as a financial sector, I do believe that we need the supervisors to move faster with regards to biodiversity. There was also one question on the chat regarding the Paris agreements. Obviously, part of what we need to do with regards to biodiversity is already included in what the current regulation sets regarding climate action, but there are parts of it that is not included. So regulation is to be moving faster. And all this is going to sound maybe negative, but I want to close with a positive comment that I made earlier on. There are a lot of companies that are ready to move on. There are a lot of niches that are financially viable, that do not need huge levels of investment. When we look at in agriculture, for example, regenerative agriculture is not that demanding from an investment perspective and can have a huge impact on protecting biodiversity, climate intelligent agriculture. So there are a lot of things that we have to do. There is no excuse to get on and move on with that. So even though there are a lot of things that are not in place, my call is to ensure we all do what we can do today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mario. And I'm just mindful of the time as well. That's a very nice segue into maybe getting one final thought from all of our panelists. Again, thank you to all of you for your fantastic insights and your thoughts throughout this conversation. Thank you to those of our participants who sent through their questions. To tie things together, could I just ask each of you to maybe take 30 seconds each and give us one takeaway for the audience, just the board members and the various business leaders sitting here. What should their takeaway from this conversation be? What should they practically be doing in their businesses to make these insights relevant for them? And Sheila, maybe let me turn to you first, and then I'll queue up Tony after Sheila.
I would say that the key takeaway, I think, should be from this, should be every board should have nature on its agenda. Every board should find a way to make this relevant to their business. There is a connection to every business. It's not always obvious. And I see that in other industries. As I said, it's easier for mining, but in other industries, climate, they've now got their head around, but they're not seeing the tie between climate and nature. And there is an absolute tie. They are not, I don't think, opposite sides of a coin. I actually think it's a continuum. So I think that it's incredibly important for every board to consider the impact that what they do has on nature, and that the changes in nature are going to have on their business and their license to continue to carry on business.
Thank you, Sheila. Tony.
I'd just build on Sheila's comment and say that, in my discussions with boards and non-executive directors, I encourage them, if they're coming to this conversation for the first time, to start with one simple question, which is how is our business or how is our investment portfolio dependent on nature? We haven't really been talking about dependence on the atmosphere when we talk about climate change. None of us expect the atmosphere to run out of oxygen and the future of humanity is in peril because we're not going to be provided with our most fundamental requirement. But in nature, we need to be asking this question about dependencies. And I think it's a very powerful, simple, powerful first question to ask. If you're a board director, is to sit down with the management team or with your portfolio managers and say, where are the dependencies of our business on nature? And that one question will open many, many doors. And to Sheila's point, it starts a productive line of inquiry around understanding impacts, because impacts and dependencies are related. And if you understand your dependencies, that's the pathway to risk to the organization. So I would really encourage everyone who's coming to this for the first time just to start with that simple question. What are the dependencies? What are our dependencies on nature?
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. Mario, to you next, and then Marcelo to close us off.
I can't add anything else. I would echo what Sheila and Tony said.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mario. Marcelo, final word to you, please.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we're reaching the end. Peter Baca, the president from WBCSD, always states that we must bring nature into the balance sheet. I think that's an important one for board members to be conscious. But my piece of advice would be to go and visit. And I think board members, sometimes they get a bit far away from where the discussion really is getting into. And I think paying a visit to where you are sourcing from, where you are operating from, who you are financing is a very revealing moment on how can you better assist and how can you better perform what you should be doing on behalf of your company and their connection to nature. So pay a visit to nature. That would be my advice.
Fantastic, Marcelo. Thank you so much for this. And let's close the webinar on that fabulous note. Thank you to everyone who's listened in. Thank you again to our panelists, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye and good luck.